Hey Judges participants, welcome to our Week 8 course video. In this video we're going to be talking a bit about Judges and what your book calls ideological criticism. So this is our last set of biblical criticisms, and I hope you've learned something in this process. There's a lot of, I think, helpful information in this book and probably a lot of confusing information in this book, so hopefully some of these videos have helped make that all a little bit more clear. So what is ideological criticism? What types of questions does it ask? And how might it help us in reading Judges? So those are the main questions that we're going to address in this video. Ideological criticism, I would say, is more commonly now called rhetorical criticism. So if you hear the term rhetorical criticism, that's probably what they're referring to. You could consider rhetorical criticism to be a subset of ideological criticism. There's many different ways to slice and dice all of these various approaches to reading the Bible, in case you haven't figured that out, so a lot of them overlap. But I've typically encountered this as being labeled rhetorical criticism. The central question in rhetorical criticism is really, of what point of view is the text trying to convince me? So ideological criticism approaches the biblical text with the idea that the text is trying to convince me as a reader and to convince its original audience as a reader of some particular point of view. And so our task as ideological critics, as rhetorical critics, is to figure out what it is that they're trying to convince us of. And then a sub-question, which is similar in a lot of other forms of criticism, is who stands to gain if the argued for point of view is adopted? So these arguments that we discern in the biblical text aren't just sort of done in a vacuum, that there are people that stand to gain or lose if one position or another is adopted. And if so, we have to think about who those people are. So here's probably the toughest assumption, at least for many people when they're encountering ideological criticism, is this assumption that the Bible makes arguments and that the Bible has arguments. So what do we really mean by that? I'll go over what I think is a maybe simpler example of the Bible and talk about how there are differing points of view in the Bible, maybe competing points of view, different perspectives, different voices, and how those voices talk to each other, talk against each other, and ultimately kind of how we sort that all out. I think the idea that the Bible has a lot of dialogue and debate seems very at home in a Jewish understanding. So if you're familiar at all with Jewish literature, you'll know that works like the Talmud are basically complex theological debates, and they are rabbis arguing with each other over different points in the text. And sometimes they'll say, Rabbi X says this, Rabbi Y says this, and the text never comes to any conclusion as to who is right. It's just sort of an open dialogue. And what that does is it allows the person studying the text to enter into the dialogue. Again, it invites people to decide what they think about the text. Now, for Christians, this is a tougher thing to get people's heads around. And I think the reason is that for so long we've tried to use the Bible as kind of a collection for kind of to a source for doctrine, if you will. So we tend to look at the Bible for answers rather than for questions or for debate. We want to use the Bible to settle arguments, not to start arguments. So I think for people in Jewish studies, this idea makes perfect sense. For people in Christianity, this idea makes us uncomfortable because we're used to kind of scientifically right answers, and we look for these in the Bible, and we use the Bible in a different way. So to understand the Bible is making arguments and having arguments is can be unsettling. So just kind of hang with me here, and I'll walk you through some examples of what I mean. So what we're really looking at here is trying to look at the Bible as a dialogical text. In other words, a text that has its own internal dialogue. It's not coming at us as only one voice, but it is a multi-voiced collection. And so there are competing ideas, debates, and dialogues going on in the Bible, as I just said. So let's work through kind of a very simple example, and I hope that this may help understand the more complex example that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So there are verses in the Bible that basically say that morality and hard work correlate with prosperity. So if you lead a good life and you work hard, you will be a prosperous person. And I'm sure all of us are familiar with sort of that argument, if you will, coming from various pulpits at various points in time. And so it's easy to find Bible verses to sort of support this idea. So just to show you a few, one is from Proverbs. The Lord does not allow the righteous to go hungry, but a slack hand causes poverty. So if you're a righteous person, you're not going to go hungry. But if you're lazy, if you have a slack hand, you're not going to be rich. In fact, you're going to fall into poverty. Here's some more. The desires of the diligent are richly provided for. So if you're very diligent in life, you are going to get whatever it is that you want. The worker of the land will have plenty of bread. Honor the Lord, and your barns will be full of plenty, and your vats bursting with wine. So as long as you honor the Lord, everything is going to go well for you. And finally, all that the righteous do, this is rewording the verse a little bit just to make it succinct, that they prosper. In other words, if you're a righteous person, whatever it is that you do will be prosperous. And we would say that, well, there is a certain amount of truth to this, that, if you don't bother to work hard on your midterm exam, you're probably not going to get a very good grade. So there is an element of truth to this position that morality and hard work can correlate with prosperity. If you are doing a lot of bad things, there is a greater chance that bad will catch up with you. So it's not that, other than maybe that first verse, the Lord does not allow the righteous to go hungry. I don't know what to do with that exactly, but the rest of the verses, I think, have some truth to them. So that is a position that you could support using Bible verses, and many people, of course, do this. But there are also parts of the Bible that push back against this idea, that would say, well, that's true, but it's not always true every time. So there are some counterexamples in the Bible. One of the more famous counterexamples is the book of Job. So Job gives us an example of a guy that was, very diligent, very attentive to following the Lord, always trying very, very hard to do the right thing. and was very prosperous, at least for a while, and then his prosperity got taken away. And if you read the book of Job, or if you've ever studied it, you'll know that Job's friends insist that his misfortune must be caused by his immorality, that he must have done something wrong, otherwise, all of this disaster would never have befallen him. So they can't really think of a world in which um, bad things happen to good people. They think, well, there must be some underlying issue here that is causing your suffering and your pain. It must be something that you did. And Job keeps pushing back, and he says, no, I didn't do anything. Um, this really isn't fair. And so he is a counterexample to the verses that I just showed you. And of course, we have Jesus. If we look at Jesus as an example of morality and moral perfection, we must think, well, if anybody should have been very rich, very prosperous, never would have had to suffer, it should have been Jesus. And ironically, Jesus does suffer, and so these are examples that I would argue push back against uh, the counterexamples that we talked about on the previous slide. So the idea that if you suffer, you must have done something wrong, maybe is true, but isn't always true. So there's a limiting of that idea in the biblical text. So there's a debate going on there, if you will. So hopefully that's a fairly simple idea before we get into the more complex things that are going on in the book of Judges. Here we go. Jesus, the ultimate example of somebody good who nonetheless suffers. Sorry, one more slide on that. So in the Yi text, I would say that the first part of her article on the intrinsic and extrinsic analysis is, I don't know, not the clearest thing I've ever read, and probably not the most helpful thing I've ever read. But I think she does an excellent job of talking about kingship versus the tribal system. And we have broached this subject many times already, particularly when we talked about Abimelech, where it seems that the Israelites want to perhaps toy with the idea of kingship. We've also talked about how the Deuteronomist, on one hand, says, Moses in Deuteronomy says that, well, um, I don't want you to have a king, but I realize you're going to have one anyway. So when you do have a king, make sure that the king follows these laws. And we talked about that as the law of the king. Now, we know that by and large the kings did not follow those laws, but the Deuteronomist is kind of accepting kingship as an inevitable development, perhaps, but still wants to push back against the idea of kingship and champion the tribal system. And if you read that section of text in Yi's book, she does a really good job, once again, of talking about the differences between those two political systems, how kingship can be very oppressive to your average farmer. A lot of power is taken away, a lot of economic resources are taken away. This can result in even oppression of women, many people have argued. So there really are people that benefit from the kingship model, and there are people that suffer from the kingship model. So there are people that are gaining and losing when the political system shifts. So again, the overall arc of the Deuteronomist is, I would say, skepticism about kingship, um, realizes it's inevitable, but doesn't really like it. So then, if this is the position of the Deuteronomist, what are we to make of this refrain that we start hearing in the book of Judges? And Ye talks about this. And this refrain that we'll see several times before the end of the book says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." Now, Ye reads this as a definite statement that because there was no king in Israel, everybody just did whatever they wanted. They developed their own system of morality. And yes, I will definitely say that is a possible reading, but I'm not quite as convinced as she is that that's what this verse says. Um, and of course, we know from reading the rest of the story that just because there's a king uh, doesn't make the people moral. That just because there's a very authoritarian leader doesn't necessarily mean that the people are going to be any more righteous than they were before. So if you want to read the rest of the story in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, that is very, very clear. But I will say that she's right from the respect that this does sound like, I don't know, a hint or a wondering about kingship. It's almost, to me, this is my own reading, it's almost as if the people think, um, if we only had a king, maybe things would be better. Again, I'm not sure where they get that idea. If they look at all of the neighboring peoples have kings, they don't, I would say, seem any more righteous than anyone else, any better or worse. Um, Maybe the king can provide some moral leadership and some moral clarity, but the king just as soon could easily drag the country down into immorality. So I'm not sure what to make of this refrain, actually. I read it as sort of the people thinking about, maybe we should try kingship. Maybe the Canaanites and all these surrounding people, the Moabites, the Ammonites, maybe they're right. Maybe this is the way we should have our society and not the way that Yahweh has set out, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. So I see it as a more of a wondering, not necessarily a for sure solution. But in any event, again, spoiler alert, we do see a collapse in the tribal system by the time we get to the end of Judges, and particularly in next week's reading. So Yi sees this refrain as a lack of kings leading to chaos. And again, to me, that's not completely logical because just because there's kings doesn't mean there is lack of chaos. But I can understand why the people are thinking this way. So, why does the tribal system break down? Why? You could argue that part of it is a lack of continuity in leadership. And we've talked about this before too, how the Israelites seem to do fine while they have strong, righteous leadership. Of course, that doesn't always happen. And then that person dies, and then everything goes to pot. And then they suffer oppression, and they have to cry out. And then Yahweh comes along and at least sometimes provides a deliverer for them. So there seems to be a problem in continuity. And we've talked about the fact that um, people need some sort of institution, most likely, to help pass on the precepts of the law. It seems that, at least for the Israelites, that even though they are commanded to teach the law to their family, for some reason they can't seem to quite pull this off. And there's always this problem where things break down, and then there has to be a sense of sort of renewal or revival or deliverance to bring them up to speed again. So I can understand the Israelites saying, wouldn't it be better if we had a king? We know exactly who the next king is going to be. It's going to be the son of the king. Isn't continuity in leadership a good thing? And I don't know, this kind of pushes up against the idea of tribal leadership, but you could see why the Israelites might think this way. Is it due to lawlessness on the part of the people? I would say most definitely yes. That is a contributing factor, and the fact that the law is not passed on. Now, here's another interesting point that we really come up against in this chapter this week on the story of Micah and the return of the dreaded ephod. In the ancient Near East, the king was in charge of worship. So the king had to sponsor worship, had to build shrines, and the king more or less ran worship of the god or gods of the people. So when you don't have a king in the Israelite sense, when you just have tribes, it seems like the story of Micah gives you a good example of how things just completely spin out of control. Now, later, Samuel, who also bucks up against problems in local worship, seems to prove that the tribal system can function adequately. So if you someday hopefully go on and read the books of Samuel and Kings, maybe with a new understanding, you'll see that Samuel's a good guy, and he definitely pulls off the tribal structure, but maybe because of what happens in this chapter and subsequent chapters of the book of Judges, maybe too much damage has been done. People no longer have faith in the tribal system, and they just cannot be convinced that the tribal system will ever be successful in terms of enforcing justice. So how does this understanding, this tension between people that want a tribal system and people that want a system of kingship, how does this help us to read Judges and the broader Deuteronomistic history? So, first of all, it just identifies the fact that there is a debate going on between these two systems in the biblical text. And just as you can find a zillion things in the book of, particularly the books of Kings, that are horribly critical of kings in Israel. Almost all of them are just horrible, horrible people. There are also other texts in the Bible that we won't go into in detail here that are very pro-monarchy. So particularly some texts in the book of Psalms that seem very much to extol the virtues of the king. If you read through the books of Chronicles, they are very pro-king and kind of leave out all of the bad things that come up in the books of Kings. So they shine a very positive light on kings. So we have this debate, if you will, going on in the Bible between people that think kingship is a good thing, or at least has the possibility of being a good thing, and people that are way more skeptical about whether a king could possibly ever enforce justice in Israel. In general, I would say that the lawlessness that we get into at the end of the book of Judges, seems to be pushing a desire for law and order, or some type of escape from chaos. And people seem to think that a king might be able to provide that. And I already mentioned that kingship may be positive for regulating worship, so this is how the rest of the ancient Near East operates, where the king is the one that decides how worship is going to go. And if you want a perfect example of this, read the description of the dedication of the temple by Solomon. So Solomon is definitely a king who is sponsoring the temple. He is dedicating the temple. He's telling us what the temple is for, and does all of these great things around setting up centralized worship, but then, of course, unfortunately ends up worshiping other gods. Now, I think one, not to get too far afield here, but I think one of the best examples of how this debate is going on in the text is so Yahweh tells Samuel that, Samuel says, the people want a king, they're demanding a king. I don't want a king. I think this is horrible. They are rejecting me as a prophet. And Yahweh says, they're not rejecting you, they're actually rejecting me. But go ahead and anoint this guy Saul as king. So you could just, if you read through the story, you can just see the reluctance of Samuel as he encounters Saul, how for chapters he doesn't even want to use the word king. It just tears at his soul. So he uses words like prince and leader and things like that. But eventually Saul becomes king. He is anointed as king. But yet, there are big conflicts between Samuel and Saul once Saul starts taking over the duties of sacrifice. So there's a story about Saul. They're waiting for a battle and they want to do a sacrifice to Yahweh. And Samuel is supposed to be there and lead it. And Samuel's not there and he's late and they want to get on with business. So Saul just says, hey, I'm going to take over. I'm going to do the sacrifice because Samuel's not here. And this is perfectly understandable in the context of ancient Near Eastern culture. This is how everybody else, all the other nations, do it. The king does not wait for some guy, some prophet, to come along. The king is in charge of worship. And when Samuel finds out that Saul is the one that's been offering sacrifice, so Samuel does show up eventually. Basically, this is the beginning of the end for Saul. So he has crossed the line for what Samuel and Yahweh think a king is supposed to be all about. But we see here this competition or this clash between whether worship is supposed to be in sort of more localized tribal hands, in the hands of prophets, or whether it is supposed to be handled by kings. And as we read the story, ultimately the kings went out. But as we read the long story, it doesn't really help the Israelites at all. So it kind of depends on what phase of the story you're in. But I think in the story of Samuel versus Saul, we really see the competition between these two systems come to a head. I hope that makes sense. If not, I don't know, go back sometime and read the stories about Samuel and Saul, and I think you'll see it. And just because you have a king regulating worship, kingship is not necessarily a reliable system because the kings are bad. They end up worshiping other gods, and this isn't a reliable system either. And kingship leads to internal oppression, as we talked about in the rule and the laws of the king, and eventually exile for many of Israelites when we get completely to the end of the story. But I think when we're done with Judges, we may, in hindsight, be able to say, You really shouldn't have gone this king route. This really wasn't what Yahweh wanted for you to do. But after you read these chapters, you may be more sympathetic as to why the Israelites chose to have a king just like all the other nations around them. When they looked at the lawlessness, the immorality, and this chaos surrounding local systems of worship, you can understand why the Israelites may have opted for a strong leader, why they thought a king was going to be the solution to all of their problems. And of course, that didn't happen. Now, I would say, this is a complete aside, but I would say that this discussion or debate even carries over into the New Testament. So you can take this for whatever it's worth to you. So when Jesus, in his preaching of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, this sounds to me a lot like 1 Samuel 8. Where you're not supposed to rely on any kings of this earth, kings like Herod, kings like Caesar, that ultimately your loyalty is to the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. So that sounds a lot like 1 Samuel 8 to me. So it seems like Jesus is sort of, in this one respect, not in all respects, but in this one respect, sort of like the Deuteronomist, skeptical of kings. But the people themselves, and I mentioned this before, they do desire a king and a deliverer. They're not looking for a spiritual leader per se. They're looking for somebody to kind of run things, to deliver them from the Romans, deliver them from perhaps Herod, and basically kind of clean up Dodge a little bit, but not necessarily looking at the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of Yahweh. They want an earthly king. Eventually in the New Testament, worship moves from the temple. So just like in all the ancient Near Eastern cultures, the temple is sponsored by royalty, by Herod. So if you know anything about the temple in Jerusalem, you know that Herod the Great rebuilt the temple, expanded it, made it all glorious. So he is the kind of prime mover and shaker of temple worship. But in the New Testament, worship moves from the temple to worship of God in spirit and in truth. So if, for example, you look at the Gospel according to Luke, at the beginning, the Gospel begins with temple worship, with John's father, and talking about temple worship. And by the end of the Gospel according to Luke, we have the breaking of bread and the community occurring in people's homes. So outside of Jerusalem, we have this sense that God does not need to be worshipped in the temple, in a temple that's controlled by royalty, but that worship can happen outside of a centralized temple. So in some elements, this debate about kings versus not kings versus more localized, kind of prophetic, tribal social systems is still kind of in the air, is still being tossed around even into the New Testament. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks. Have a great day.